very much. Well, this is very much some preliminary thoughts on trying to organise all this disparate material into some kind of framework. And having heard Steve Douglas, I can see I've got to do a lot of revision still. So please bear with me. Now, okay, so I want to start by saying, on some reflection, the basic aim, steady state economy is not an end in itself, but rather it's one objective in a broader aim, which I suggest is to foster an ecologically sustainable planet and a fairer society while providing a reasonably good quality of life for all. And I feel that this aim would probably be accepted by the majority of Australian individuals overwhelmingly, although we need to dig down as to what it actually means, and it would be opposed very strongly by a number of large corporations which are engaged in activities that most of us would disapprove of. So if we go down to some more specific properties of this rather broad aim, we can see enhancing individual and community well-being, providing for equity, which is not equality, it's equal opportunity in the basics between generations and within generations, to protect biological diversity and ecosystem integrity, and to apply the precautionary principle. Now, some of the older members of the audience might recognise these as the original ecologically sustainable development principles. They were somewhat watered down as they appeared in the National Strategy for Ecological Development. But again, it would be interesting to do a survey to find what sort of support those principles have in the community. And I'd be surprised if the majority of people didn't support them. Okay, so we've got the aim and the more specific parts of it. So what does this mean in terms of the objectives? Now, I think in the long run, we do have to aim for global caps on pollution, global caps on the rates of production of renewable resources. And they need to be global caps because otherwise we get this problem that was discussed earlier in the conference, that pollution is just transferred from one country to another. So a lot of Britain's pollution appears in manufacturing that is done overseas for Britain and then imported. A lot of Australia's pollution comes from exports of our coal and other minerals which are then utilised elsewhere. So obviously going initially for a global caps is going to be rather difficult. So we probably have to start with working at national and subnational levels. We need to, of course, work for basic needs for all: food, water, shelter, health, security, education, and so on. And last but not necessarily least, an economic system that is compatible with these objectives. Now we have to consider the barriers, and I've been encouraged that today there's been increasing talk of some of the actual barriers. So yes, in a way we can say it is our culture, our consumer culture, but this is new. The growth culture is, as someone has pointed out, really a post-World War II phenomenon. The GDP concept was post-World War II. So we need to dig down underneath. And I think we will find when we do that, that there are some very powerful vested interests that are actually driving this culture, through advertising, through political lobbying, through donations to political parties, and through basically having an overwhelming influence on large sections of the media, our politicians, and public officials. And there's often a very rapid transfer of people between the public service and large corporations and back again, and Guy Pearce has pointed out this very nicely. And then we have this economic system that it fosters endless biophysical growth as well as economic growth, and the exploitation of people and the environment and inequities. Okay, so how do we tackle these And we need to aim to end both biophysical growth and to reduce throughput, and also to provide a fairer society. So I'm starting at the international level, even though I think that will probably come last in terms of what we can actually implement. So we do need to work towards mandatory international agreements on what is called contraction and convergence, which means basically the rich countries use less and emit less pollution per capita as time goes on, while the developing countries are allowed for a time, allowed to increase their emissions until all countries converge to a common low value of emissions, if we're talking about greenhouse gases or something else. In fact, if we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, we might aim for a target of maybe 5 tonnes per person per year, but in the long run, we probably have to go to 0. So it goes. And we need agreements not only at the intergovernmental level, but at the people-to-people level. And this is something we can be engaged in. Further, at the national and subnational level, of course, well, pricing has been mentioned, pricing and taxation, pricing of externalities. And I heard someone say yesterday that you can't really change from fossil fuels because they're so cheap. And of course, really, when we think about it, we know they're not cheap. They have enormous externalities, so-called, which are not included in their prices. We need government incentives to make a transition, and there's a whole raft of possible policies there. We need regulations and standards, particularly for things like energy efficiency, where the market doesn't work well at all. We need greater support for local manufacturing and so-called green goods. We need a broader set of indicators, and we need a set of institutions that actually foster these changes through governance and education and monitoring and finance. Okay, all this is pretty obvious, I know. So what about some more specific recommendations? And yesterday, when I was discussing with someone, sorry, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, so I'm a bit more incoherent than usual. The question was asked, well, what's social justice got to do with this? And of course, as a result of today's presentations, it's pretty clear that social justice and environmental protection and human well-being are intimately linked and can't really be separated. If there is no growth, no economic growth, then social justice has to become a high priority, reducing inequality. So a lot of these recommendations are actually recommendations on social justice. And the idea is to present recommendations that have multiple benefits, so that although we need to get an overall picture of what can be done and what has to be done, we need, in order to promote them, we need to be aware of that they have other benefits in the community. So many of these have been mentioned already: estate and land tax to target accumulated wealth, guaranteed minimum income and maximum income, working time reduction, Tobin tax, they've all been mentioned really. We need higher reserves demanded for lending by financial institutions, perhaps ultimately transitioning to 100% reserves. Now that is heresy. I've discussed it with economists and financial people. But the benefits are enormous in terms of financial stability, as well as weakening the power of some of the large vested interests. So all of these individual measures are designed to gradually weaken the power of those who are pushing us in the endless growth situation. Corporations law needs to be reformed. That's a very difficult one because corporations have enormous power. One of the things I'd like to ask Jennifer about is what are the barriers to forming cooperatives and other non-for-profit organisations. Certainly in Australia, we're aware of a number of barriers. which make it difficult. Advertising, type controls, and actual research on the steady state economy and transition paths. Okay, I'm just going to quickly, in the remaining few minutes, run through a case study in one of my favourite areas, which is energy generation and use. So the aim becomes replacing the existing energy system with one that's sustainable. In other words, clean, lean, and the lean part, of course, is reducing the throughput. Safe, and I couldn't resist putting that billboard picture up, thinking of Fukushima's spill. And long-lasting, affordable, and job-creating. And I think you know where I'm going with this. So, clean, of course, over its whole life cycle. Lean, particularly by energy efficiency, which is having the same energy services while using less energy. Energy conservation, which is reducing your energy services, so it's more behavioural. And smart grids, safe, long-lasting as long as the sun shines, or perhaps before it engulfs the earth in a few billion years' time, affordable, and job-creating. So, sustainable energy solutions involve renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy conservation, and in electricity, smart grids. They comprise a wide variety of sources, so that even though we couldn't run the whole system on wind alone or on solar alone, they have different statistical properties, and when you put them together, as Ben Elliston, Ian McGill and I have found in our computer simulations of 100% renewable electricity, we find that we can create a system here that is just as reliable as the existing polluting system, but running on 100% renewables. And it's not that expensive. So for policies and strategies, again, we need international agreements to share out the remaining carbon budget. We need pricing. And I think there is an important role for carbon pricing, particularly carbon tax. And I quite like the idea of the dividend, returning the money to everyone, every adult in equal shares, for example. Feed-in tariffs have a role in the transition. I think pricing is necessary, but it is not sufficient, because if you don't have a perfect market, which you almost never do, pricing alone will not drive change. People will just have to pay the additional amount. We need targets, we need regulations and standards, we need appropriate institutions, and lo and behold, I was listing institutions that we might need, and Clean Energy Finance Corporation, Renewable Energy Agency, Climate Commission, Energy Information Centre, so on. And I sort of realised these are all the things that the Howard government and some of the state governments are trying to abolish at present, and have abolished some. Sorry, gosh. I didn't notice there was any discontinuity. And we need community action, and we're starting to get that. Community renewable energy projects are vital. The transition in Denmark and Germany was primarily based on community projects. I mean, there's 800 community projects operating right now in Germany, maybe more, but since I last looked, 800. Community education projects bring people together. They create renewable energy, but they also spread the message and engage people actively. Community finance is very important for these projects. And also community campaigns to divest from fossil fuels. It's not enough for us as individuals to shift our savings to the Bendigo Bank and to shift our superannuation out of fossil fuel investments. We really need to operate on a bigger scale. And ultimately, this is a power struggle. And as I think I mentioned in the discussion earlier at this conference, there is a huge power struggle going on right now about the government, state and several state and the federal government trying to stop the growth of renewable energy. And it is and there's a fight back going on with community meetings in marginal cities. Governments, and I think Richard Dennis has really said this all, but just to underline it, that governments and big business rarely respond to appeals to reason and ethics alone. Such appeals must be backed up with community power, with credible, feasible threats to votes in the case of governments and sales with respect to businesses. So we need to campaign at various levels, whether we're campaigning directly or indirectly for a steady state economy or for an energy efficient, renewable energy society. One campaign that isn't yet being conducted is for electricity consumers to leave the big electricity retailers, which are the ones that are lobbying governments to terminate the renewable energy target. So we're talking about Origin Energy, AGL, and Energy Australia. And it's a little tricky as an individual at this stage because I've just moved house and I've found the only electricity retailer that isn't trying to reduce or terminate the renewable energy target in my region is Momentum Energy, which doesn't pay anything for feeding solar energy back into the grid, but I've gone with them and I'm going to buy some batteries. So it goes. So there's a long history of community success in exercising countervailing power to large institutions. The top picture shows a picture from divestment in the anti-apartheid campaign of quite a few decades ago. The bottom picture is taken at a public meeting organised by the Australian Solar Council a few weeks ago in a marginal seat in Brisbane to oppose the termination of the renewable energy target. We can do it, but we have to become active. We need to combine reason and ethics and good scholarship for those of us who are academics with a public campaign. So thank you very much, and copies of my book are still available over there.